Ruchem Aboyim, welcome to the fourth in the continuing series of lectures on the Yud Gimel Midas Torah Nidreshes Bahem, on the 13 hermeneutic principles which of exegesis which the sages have used in order to extract and to interpret the written Torah. At the end of last week's lecture, I mentioned the Greek dimension and aspect to the Yud Gimel Midas, and I wanted to discuss that in detail. And the reason I'm actually bringing it up, because this has been the subject of a certain amount of scholarly research, and I think that any series of shiur and Yud Gimel Midas certainly has to address this to any either intelligent or informed audience, as I assume that's who I'm addressing. The two articles which I might have mentioned at the end of week's lecture is one article which was written, I believe, it appeared in 1940 by the distinguished, I guess, classical scholar or scholar of ancient law, David Daube, who I think obviously was Jewish. He was a Yeke, he was a German. And it appears in the HUCA Journal 22, 1940. And it's entitled Rabbinic Methods of Interpretation in Hellenistic Rhetoric. And there, Professor Daube notes a very, very strong similarity between the Yud Gimel Midas and the and Greek theories of rhetoric, of interpretation of texts. And I think it's even at the beginning of the article, he wants to seem to make the claim that, in fact, that the Yud Gimel Midas Chas v'Shalom, God forbid, that's my insertion, were derived from the Greek methods of rhetoric. At the end of the article, he wants to say that these were things that were in the air. This was the type of learning that was being done by intellectuals at the time, and there's no doubt that Hillel was, in fact, under this type of, of Hellenistic influence, and therefore the Yud Gimel Midas are none other than the Jewish version of Hellenistic rhetoric. An article...
Hellenistic here, you mean Greek and
Greek, right, yeah, Hellenism, right. Yavan. Now, otherwise known as Yavan. Now, there's an article, I'm not sure exactly when the article was published, but Professor Saul Lieberman, also in his book on, I think in Hellenism and Palestine, I forget the name of the book. It's a collection of articles. Also has an article, and there too, he actually quotes Daube. So he wasn't the first one to say this, but there too he notes, in fact, actually the similarity and the parallelism between what appears in Hellenistic theories of rhetoric and interpretation, and in the Yud Gimel Midas, and the article is devoted to that. And of course, he invokes a bit of his depth of breadth, and breadth of Ekiyos and Chazal, and showing. Of course, there he doesn't want to say that he says explicitly. He doesn't want to say like Chas v'Shalom that Hillel derived these things, but he just says that there's an interesting parallel. Actually, the person that he actually quotes is actually a Karaite, a Karoi. He quotes a Yehuda Hadassi, who was a Karoi. He was a Karaite, and it's in the sefer called Eshkol HaKofer Kuf Chav Daled Beis. It's in the if you look at I have the Lieberman article actually translated into Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, and there it appears on 190, page 190, and so actually it's very, very good. I'm happy. And so this Karoi accuses the Chazal of taking the Yud Gimel Midas from the Greek, so it's good. Tzidkus, in other words, that was they were hitting below the belt, and as we saw last week, that the Tzidkus, now Karoi is looking at two different things, but just like the Tzidkus were against the Yud Gimel Midas, so here this Karoi is actually being a bit of a kanoi, and he's claiming that Chazal were like a little bit too enlightened, and they'd actually gotten some of their, the Yud Gimel Midas from the Greek methods of interpretation of Scripture. So Lieberman continues on this and says that actually we're in a position right now to verify what this guy said, etc. And that's his position. I want to go through the entire article. Those of you interested, you can look at it. If not, you just hear the shiur, and we'll try to summarize some of the arguments. First of all, I don't know Greek, but on the other hand, though, I think Daube and Lieberman, it's clear from the quotes that are being quoted. Of course, the quotes that are in this article are either in Latin or Greek. I'm not really conversant in either ones, but let's assume that the quotes are verbatim or precise, exact. So therefore, in other words, there's no doubt, right? There's no doubt from here that we see that there must have been methods of rhetoric of Greek which bear some type of resemblance to the Gittin Midos. Daube goes through all of them, and so does Lieberman, but I want to mainly focus on a few of them. Actually, up till now, of course, in these shiurim, we've been speaking about the gzeira shava, and a little bit the kal v'chomer, mostly gzeira shava, but we'll speak about kal v'chomer too, because kal v'chomer, gzeira shava, minyanav are actually included more or less in the as the first three midas, so it's more or less the same, as opposed to klal, pat, klal, etc. First of all, the fact that we see things in Chazal, which appear in Greek philosophy, Greek rhetoric, is not we shouldn't look at that as chas v'shalom being anyway a contradiction to anything. And I want to speak a little bit about Rav Tzadok. Rav Tzadok HaCohen actually speaks about this. Rav Tzadok HaCohen, in several places, in the Tzidkus, in several places in his writings, notes the fact that there is a concept called Zulu Mazu. He speaks about this in Pri Tzadik. He speaks about this in many of his Sfarim. Resisei Laila. There are numerous. There are so many places that so numerous he speaks about. I don't even have to quote all of them. But whoever is in any way familiar with Rav Tzadok's philosophy and his very deep understanding of these issues understands and to be a davar pashut, that with every change in paradigm, there's also somehow a equivalent change in paradigm when it with regard to the Mesorah and the nations of the world. So, for example, Tzaddik in Tzidkus ha-Tzadik, for example, in Siman Tzaddik, famous Rav Tzadok, where he speaks about that there's a commensurability between Chachmas HaTorah and the Chachmas U'B'Olam, Tzidkus ha-Tzadik, Siman Tzaddik. And actually, later on in Tzidkus ha-Tzadik, I think it's in Siman Reish Mem Tes, there Rav Tzadok speaks about that actually part of the purpose of Golus speaks about Avraham Avinu going to Mitzrayim, he's going to take all the Kesef V'Zav, and there Rav Tzadok actually, in tremendous arichas with many rayas and proofs, wants to show that one of the purposes of Golus, of exile, is that there are bits and pieces of chachma, of wisdom, which are dispersed and been captured in the exile in the different nations, and the purpose of exile, a purpose of exile and therefore redemption, is somehow to recover these aspects of chachma that in fact that exist in these places, and to bring them back into kedusha. Tzaddik elaborates on that. In fact, actually, in Takanas Ha-Shavin, I'm on I think probably since the Tzaddik has probably come out in a new edition, but on Daf Lamed Daled, I guess I would call it Lamed Daled with base, second column, or page 67. There, Tzaddik actually speaks about that part of the chet, and the consequences of the chet of Eitzadas, and the tree of knowledge of Eitzadas, of knowledge of Tevorah, is that there was the dispersion of elements of Torah among the nations, and part of the tikkun, and really actually the purpose of the tikkun, which is actually affected through Torah Shebi'al Peh, right? Through Torah Shebi'al Peh, is really, in fact, recovering these elements of Torah which have been scattered among the nations, and this he goes into detail. And of course, this is a sheni Gilomid, this is not a drasha, and it's not a drasha. This is like a shiur. But Rav Tzadok does explain that, in fact, actually, that that's part of Torah Shpiel Peh, is to recover these elements of das, of chachma, which become dispersed as a consequence of the chet of Eitz HaDas. The only reason I'm bringing this, is not, in other words, is to show that in fact that the fact that we might see things in Chazal that bear resemblance to Greek concepts is not something that we should that should unnerve us. On the contrary, it's really, in other words, I mean, I don't think ha-Tzadik was a classical scholar on the level of Professor Daube, but just from his his Bekias B'chol HaTeira Kula, ha-Tzadik in fact actually understands this to be a yesod, that a fundamental idea that in fact actually we will see throughout Jewish history what we would think to be elements of what we call quote unquote foreign thought, which are somehow bear resemblance or bear commensurability to elements of the Torah too. I might add, Avdecha HaNe'eman, your faithful servant, that in fact at the end of I looked in a I see that I don't know if somebody brings this. I looked in a you have a question? But I looked in a I looked actually in a an English Rav Tzadok. I see he doesn't mean this Maramaka, but the most famous Maramaka thing about this is actually at the end of Seder Ilim Rabbah. It says that when Alexander Makdon comes to Yerushalayim, it says Atkan is Dabu and Mikan ve'elech Hatishma Divrei Chachamim. And there we see clearly that the Seder Ilim Rabbah is somehow in other words, is making a connection between the cessation of prophecy and the commandments of Nevuah, which I guess begins with certainly probably begins with Rav Shimon ha-Tzadik, but in other words, certainly Hillel and Shava not much after that, and between and the meeting of the meeting of cultures between the Torah and between Greek cultures. In other words, clearly the Seder Rabbah is making this type of a parallel.
Could be the Tzidkus is chaylik on that because he holds its Purim, that is Kiblu, which is the end of Chayim. Right. In other words, I'm just bringing two members with Tzidkus HaTzadik. There's a whole arichas in this in different places and everything with this Purim. I just, in other words, all I want to bring out is that, in other words, the notion of parallelism, commensurability between the Chachmas HaTeira and what we call Chachma, Chachmas Yava is not something which is shakas, but actually it's a part. It's Chazals. It's Chazals which Tzaddik interprets accordingly. Can I ask, is there any hekesh in the concept of Kal v'chomer? Doesn't every system of human logic that's ever existed subscribe to a concept of Kal v'chomer?
So the fact is that Daube actually speaks about this. He speaks about this. He says that he speaks in a Chanami, right? About Kal v'chomer is not such an abstract thing. That you should think that you needed a hekesh of the Greeks, but the fact is, he makes note that in different classical works, the order of the principles follows the order that we see in the Yud Gimel Midos. In other words, Kal v'chomer comes from gzeira shava. In other words, he makes to do it. I know he admits the fact that this could be possibly true. But in any case, what I wanted to speak about is I wanted to address actually these issues, and with due respect both to Professor Daube and to Shaul Lieberman, I think that they're grossly mistaken in their analysis, and that's what I want to speak about today, or this evening. This evening. Daube, for example, it's interesting, quotes I'm on page 251. I don't expect you to have the article in front of you, but in any case, in 251, he speaks about a Kal v'chomer. I'm quoting him. The first of these norms is the inference is the A4 tiari or A minari at mayus, in Hebrew Kal v'chomer, the light and the weighty. He gives an example, and he says rhetorical parallels abound, and he quotes Cicero. I guess this is the historian Cicero. What applies to the meus must also apply to the minus, and vice versa. I guess that's a Kal v'chomer. And there he's actually dividing Kal v'chomer into two things, going from the Kal to the chomer, and the chomer to the Kal. Again, what applies to one thing must apply to that which is equal, and that's actually he's identifying with a gzeira shava. In other words, he's putting Kal v'chomer together with gzeira shava, and I see here in the footnote, on footnote number 43. He says the writer refrains from being more explicit about Hitler's second, third, and fourth norms because they're
original nature and history has not so far been appreciated, but it would lead too a far field here to go into them. For a certain aspect of the second, gzeira shava, see above. Basically, Daube doesn't even go into it. He just assumes, he finds he finds a reference and that's it. But actually, I think it's here where actually Daube's analysis fails and fails very, very significantly. First of all, he says, I'm not going to go into, well, what are the other things? I mean, he's speaking out here about kal vachomer, but of course there's gzeira shava, which he doesn't really go into that much. And then after that, of course, there's binyanav, binam mishtek suvim, because of echab, right? In other words, in Hillel. Now, the important thing, which I want to relate to, which is important here, is that the assumption here, and also Lieberman actually too, on page, in Hebrew edition, on page 191, also speaks about, he speaks about a kal vachomer. He actually brings the same quote, but not from Cicero, but from someone called Hermogenes. I don't know, I'm not, those of you who know classics do not, excuse this abaratzos, but there also he brings like a very similar quote from this person, and in fact, actually there he actually there tries to define what a gzeira shava is, and it's actually an equation, right? In other words, actually the concept of to Lieberman of a gzeira shava is just really an equation of two things, which actually for us would actually in fact be in hekesh. And actually Lieberman's assertion is that the lashon of the Tosefta, which speaks about that Hillel was making gzeira shava, was really actually a later lashon. Really, the gzeira shava is really a hekesh of two things together, and that's what a gzeira shava is. In fact, actually, he defines a gzeira. He says gzeira shava has nothing to do with two words. I mean, with all due respect, that's what he wants to say. He mentions one place that they look for two words in common, but really the point of a gzeira shava is equating two concepts, which is, in fact, actually what we call the hekesh. And that's really what a gzeira shava is. Now, I think that we have a little bit of a misunderstanding, and I want to explain what this means.
That is according to Lieberman, or that?
According to Lieberman. That's what Lieberman saying. No, that's what Lieberman saying. In fact, I think even his, I don't know if it was his colleague, his distinguished colleague at the JTS, having Lezer Finkelstein, in this Hagdama to his additional text Kahanim, also makes a point that really gzeira shava is really, in fact, an equation of two things, and that's like a later lashon Chazal, etc., etc. Whenever I guess you can't get things to work out because I'll use the wrong lashon. You try to basically say that they use different lashonas at different periods. In scholarship that's a very, very frequent ploy. But I want to claim that these two scholars, and I'm saying this with of course great humility, that these two scholars have gotten it absolutely totally wrong. And let me explain to you why I feel they've gotten it totally wrong. First of all, a gzeira shava, as we explained, is not a hekesh. It's not an equation of two things. In other words, a gzeira shava might originate, as we spoke about, originates in a hekesh. We've spoken about this in the last few shiurim. But the actual gzeira shava, right, is more than an equation between two things. It's actually two words, and as we spoke about in detail, in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah, I mean this is throughout Shas, but I use the Gemara Shapa as a prime example, that the gzeira shava goes beyond the notion of logical equation. That's very, very important. In other words, a hekesh gives us a logical equation, but gzeira shava is what I would call a linguistic identity, and that's, in my opinion, I mean, look, I'm not a classical scholar, I apologize, but after having read these articles thoroughly several times, I did not get the impression that Greek rhetoric in any way, right, speaks or considers as a postulate or as an idea, taking two words and creating an identity. And that's an important thing. Now, from this, I want to go a little further and explain to you what I think is the misunderstanding here among the scholars, and I think we could really even, it says, Dama, the Bible says, says, Dama Havishakil Moteira Dama Lahashav Lapikoides. In other words, sometimes when we answer the Apikoides, we have to look a little bit deeper into what Chazal is saying, and sometimes it can, enlighten us. But the fact is that the Greeks themselves might have had standards of principles of rhetoric, but they're logical principles. A kal v'chomer is not a gzeira shava in and of itself is not a logical principle. It might be generated, as I said before, by a logical principle, but it's a linguistic identity of two things. Now, it is true that they speak about kal v'chomer. He speaks about a fartuori or a minori et maius. Excuse my pronunciation of the Latin, but the fact is that I think there's a misunderstanding of what the Midos are. In Mirz Hashem, I'm not going to go into this in this shiur, but to give you coming attractions, the relationship between a hekesh and a gzeira shava parallels the relationship between a kal v'chomer and a binyan av. In other words, if we look at the Midos are actually a text which presents to us a spectrum and or dialectic between logical principles and between, I would call it, scriptural, linguistic principle, linguistic identities or linguistic objects. In other words, just like the kal v'chomer, which is a logical principle, most of the time, I haven't taken that survey, but certainly much of the time, in Chazal, ends up being a binyan av. And a binyan av is in fact not a really purely logical principle. A binyan av, even though you can make a pircha on a kal v'chomer, it's much more difficult to make a pircha on a binyan av. So, in other words, in the same way too, we have a relationship between a hekesh and a gzeira shava. The hekesh is a logical principle. The gzeira shava is not a logical principle. Okay? Yeah.
Rabbi Triebitz said in previous shiurim that the hekesh came as a Kabbalah from the previous.
We'll get to this once. We're going to get to this. Wait. It's getting more. Right. In those cases that we saw, the hekesh did come as a principle for that, but we're going to see a little more. But you see the gzeira shava goes beyond the hekesh.
So what I'm asking, maybe Rav Triebitz is going to deal with this, is if the gzeira shava is not based in logic and itself doesn't come as a Kabbalah, but is a development from a Kabbalah.
Well, we do say Adam dan gzeira shava li'atzmai, but that's for sure.
So did they get the gzeira shava as a Kabbalah or didn't they?
No, the hekesh is a Kabbalah from which they create the text of the gzeira shava.
So how did they create the gzeira shava?
Well, we'll speak a little while. That was.
If it's not logical.
What?
If it's not logical,
well, that's
it's not a Kabbalah. How did they create it?
Well, the gzeira shava. I'm not sure what your question is. I mean, how you want to know all the details? I don't know the principle, the details how they created it. But I'm saying, the point of gzeira shava is that. I think that's the wrong question, how they created it. I can't tell you how they created it, but the fact is we know from this Gemara Rosh Hashanah that the gzeira shava is something more than a logical principle. Because it's an identity of two things. That's what we're speaking about, that we hear when we spoke about the Ritva. In other words, it's an identity of two things. I mean, we'll see in a little while where the gzeira shava comes from. What I'm saying is that, my point is that gzeira shava is not a logical principle. It's based upon a hekesh, an equation of two things, but it's two words which create an identity. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to explain this in the following way. Derech Agav, this concept of the Midos, or the Yugil Midos, as even Hillel's Midos, but Yugil Midos, as basically consisting of what you would call the logical dimension and the linguistic dimension. It's interesting is that, I mean, you'll excuse me for 5 minutes, I'm going to make a little bit of a drasha. It says in Masechah Seifrim that when they translate the Torah into Greek, into Yavanis, when they translate into Greek, so the Masechah Seifrim says, Kasha Hayom, it was difficult today, Shenitna Egel, the Egel was given, that the golden calf was given. What is translating the Torah to get to with the Cheta Egel? But if you follow the thoughts of the Beis Halevi, both in the Drosha and the Shut Beis Halevi, and I think it's Beis Halevi La Torah, then in fact, as a result of the at the Chet of the Egel Azov, there was a bifurcation between the Tersh V'Yater and Tersh V'Chsav. So too, I think what happened is that as a result of the influence of Greece, but somehow at that time, you have over here a type of bifurcation between what you call logical principles and linguistic principles. And both of these are actually Midos, but these principles actually act. Sometimes one generates the other, but sometimes they can act a little bit in dialectical opposition. And that's the point that I want to make. Now, the point I want to make is a Gemara in Mem Aleph of Beis in Gittin. The Gemara there, in Mem Aleph of Beis in Gittin, the Gemara there is speaking about, is it possible to free half a slave? The Gemara says, Tana Rabbi Meshachel Chatzi Avdoi. You can free half a slave. So there's a machlokes between Rebbe and Chachamim. Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, the Mechap of the Mishnah, and Chachamim. So Rebbe says, Kaina. In other words, you can free half a slave. Chachamim oimim loy kaina. Chachamim said, no, doesn't work. So comes Rabba, Omer Rabba, right? And Amayra comes Rabba. Machlokes b'shtar. Machlokes if you do it with shtar. In other words, everybody agrees that if you do it with kesef, because you can do it with a shtar. The Rebbe Sava, the Rebbe says, is a pasuk in Vayikra, v'hafta loy diftasa, oy chupasa loy nosan la. So Rebbe says, maki shtar la kesef. Rebbe makes a hekesh between shtar and kesef. Ma kesef, ben kula ben chetziyav. Just like kesef, you could free all of it or half of it. You can do anything with money. Av shtar nami ben kula ben chetziyav. Also to a shtar, you can free half a slave with a shtar. Rabbanan gamiri la la mishma. Kabbalah says no, we have a gzeira shava from Isha, right? Because it says al chubas al nitan la Isha. Ma Isha chetziyav loy. Just if you came to Kaddish half of an Isha, you should all know that from the first parak of Kedusha. I think most yeshivas usually get to that. So then I think this right. Right? Av evid nami chetziyav loy. Okay. In other words, so just like you have this gzeira shava that you came to Kaddish half an Isha, you came to Shacha half an evid. Okay, but everybody have a now. Now what's the machlokes? Interesting machlokes. It's very interesting. Rebbe is using a hekesh. Rebbe is using a hekesh, and Chachamim are using a gzeira shava. So you got it. What's the machlokes? What's stronger, a hekesh or a gzeira shava? Very good. Ma'asava hekesh adifa. One opinion holds a hekesh is stronger. Uma'asava gzeira shava adifa. And one opinion says a gzeira shava is stronger. Very interesting. So then the Gemara says no. Lo yidikul alma gzeira shava adifa. Everyone holds gzeira shava adifa, and here it's different because there's a pilcha on the gzeira shava. Now, I don't want to go into the entire sugi. The entire sugi here is very complicated because actually there's actually a taisvis in Zvochadap and Chesh, which I'm not going to go into now. And there's also a long Gemara in Chesed of Chaveis. But the interesting is, here, in other words, I have a gzeira shava, but according to one opinion, it's a pircha, the gzeira shava. Now, first of all, what is the machlokes? So I noticed that there's a bit of a dispute. Actually, I'm going to read first from Rabbeinu Kreskas, published by Mesorah Rav Kook, Mem Aleph Amud Beis. Okay, because the Gemara says there's a pilcha and a gzeira shava. Okay, so I'm Mesorah Rav Kook. Mesorah Rav Kook actually doesn't go by pages; it goes by columns. So it's column Shin Samach Beis. Okay, it's almost equal to the days of the solar year. And Gemara, but the shiny hacha the ika and the mifrach. Mifrach means we can make a pilcha on the gzeira shava. The Gemara's pilcha. I should really read that pilcha. The Gemara says, "Now the woman doesn't go out with money, but the Ever goes out with money. That's the pilcha on the gzeira shava. So, right? So the Ritva, Rabbeinu Kreskas asks the question: V'kashalach im kein mai tamid rabbanan. I mean, if it's a pilcha, so what's why Chachamim saying? In other words, if in fact actually there's a pircha, so why is it making a gzeira shava? So says the Beno Kleskas, v'yesh loima, right? The Vadikul Alma Gemiri, there was everybody, well actually, on the bottom it says Bisavri, everybody learns that there's a gzeira shava. The high gzeira shava, everybody's a gzeira shava. For Avogam, the Havabu Kama Prichi, you can be mafik the gzeira shava, right? Gzeira shava kushne is still a true gzeira shava. That's the chum. In other words, even though I can be mafik gzeira shava, it's still like gzeira shava still holds. That's chachamim. Now what about Rebbe? Obviously Rebbe doesn't hold like this. So it says about Kleskas, Elo the Rebbe Sava that came in the Ika Pilcha, the Gabi High dinner. The Rebbe says no. Since the Pilcha, with respect to this din, the Pilcha is that a woman is not Yesib Kesef, but is Yesib Kesef. V'Ikanam hekesh, and we have a hekesh between Shtar and Kesef. Haidina lo gemira minei hekesh adif. So because of this, we don't learn the gzeira shava because the hekesh is stronger, right? And abundance of it, the cave in the east line of the shava, the gamin gamil lechol davar. Now, very interesting. What's going on here? What's going on here? I mean, what is this thing? I have a gzeira shava. I have a pircha. What's the pircha? A gzeira shava doesn't have a pircha. Even though actually we'll see Mit Hashem in a few shiurim from now, that's actually much more complicated. Because actually when the Ritva learns it and Rashi too, is that in Chafar Beis, there can be mufim mitzarecha, mishnei stadim. I don't want to go into this as an entire sukkah, but what am I taking this example? Let's try to analyze what's going on over here. If I have a gzeira shava, why might I think there's a pilcha on the gzeira shava? I mean, what are we saying? I mean, we're beyond that. What is there a pilcha? There's a pilcha on a hekesh. On a hekesh, there's a pilcha. A hekesh is a logical principle. A gzeira shava, assuming that we learn the gzeira shava, it's not a logical principle. There's no pilcha. I don't want to go into mufim mitzarecha, mufim mishnei stadim. He doesn't make that chiluk over here. The point is the following point. The point is, I think here we have this yesod. Remember, there's a machlokes. The point is over here, a gzeira shava certainly is generated by a hekesh. That we all agree to. At least I think I've established that, and I'm not chayzer from it. It certainly stands on a hekesh. The question is, right, how strong does that hekesh have to be to produce the gzeira shava? In other words, the hekesh that Hillel made, which produced the gzeira shava, was obviously a very strong hekesh. No, there was no pircha the gzeira shava. In fact, when they said to them, they said, a person, you're done this, right? But here, the hekesh is not quite as strong. There's a pircha really on the hekesh. In other words, what I understand is that when I'm going from the hekesh to the gzeira shava, right? But Hillel's saying, but the hekesh here, the logical principle, right, is not so strong. In other words, there must have been a machlokes. In other words, so what we have is the following thing. The following is, the hekesh, one could ask a certain pircha on this hekesh. But the Beno Kleskas is not saying, see, this is a machlokes in using the rules. It's not a machlokes on the hekesh. The question is, according to chachamim, when I go from a hekesh to a gzeira shava, I can't ask a pircha anymore on the gzeira shava. That's exactly what a gzeira shava does. What gzeira shava does, it takes me from a logical principle to a linguistic principle, a linguistic identity. So there's no pircha on it anymore. But according to Rebbe, right, you can't go from a hekesh to a gzeira shava if in fact actually there's a pircha on it, and if I have an alternative to the gzeira shava, another hekesh, that I do. Now, what's the point of this Gemara? What is the machlokes telling us? What it's telling us is that even when we go, and this is what addressing your point, even when I go from the hekesh to the gzeira shava, it's not absolutely like the point of no return.
It is for the chachamim.
No, but not for Rebbe. We see there's a machlokes on that. In other words, the point is that when I create this gzeira shava, there's obviously a dispute between Rebbe and chachamim. In other words, what are the criteria? What are the hekesh criteria or logical criteria which allow me to establish this gzeira shava? According to Rebbe, if I can be mafed the gzeira shava, the hekesh, and I have an alternative hekesh, I don't cross the line to the gzeira shava. Because once I'm at the gzeira shava, there's a point of no return. I can't be mafed the gzeira shava anymore. Gzeira shava applies. That's what Rabbi Triebitz is saying. Now, what I brought this example is showing is that I think that Professor Daube and Professor Lieberman got it wrong. Because this machlokes and Rabbi Chachamim could never have existed in the rhetoric of Cicero or the rhetoric of the Ginnis, I don't know whoever his name is. It couldn't have existed. Because the Greeks begin and end with logical principles. Even though a midah has a logical dimension to it, in other words, it's based upon a logical dimension, there's a there's a crossover or a dialectic or transition from the logical principle to the linguistic principle, which in and of itself, therefore, is somehow inoculated, from logic, from any logical critique. There is a dispute as to what that relationship is. But the fact is that the Yud Gimel Midas are not logical principles. The Yud Gimel Midas, in my humble opinion, are a text which creates a dialectic between logical principles and linguistical principles. In other words, if I could even quote Rav Tzadok again, Rav Tzadok says somewhere else that Chachmi Avanas is the chitzonius of Torah. You might be speaking about a Kabbalah there, I don't know, whatever it is chitzonius of Torah. In other words, it might be that when the Torah, that after the time of prophecy, after the time of the Nevuah, when now the Torah clearly somehow bifurcates, in a certain sense the way it did after Chet HaEgel, when the Torah bifurcates between clearly defined logical principles and linguistic principles, right? Then, in other words, it might be that the logical principles, which now represent principles in and of themselves, might bear resemblance to Greek, logical principles of rhetoric. But that's not the midah. The midah is the collusion. The midah is the interaction or the dialectic between the logical principle and between the scriptural identity. So, in other words, I reject both these articles. I don't think that a gzeira shava is a gzeira shava. It's not a logical principle. It might be generated by a logical principle. That's the beginning. But the end of it is a gzeira shava. And the gzeira shava is more than a logical principle. And the path, the logical path from a hekesh, from the logical equation to the linguistic identity is a path which is rather complex, and as we see, is subject in several cases to what we see a machlokes dispute among Tanaim, Rabbi and Chachamim. Now, in other words, the question is, you ask how they put together the gzeira shava. So, in other words, what we spoke about the last few shurim is that what happens is we have here the creation of a text. Meaning that what? Meaning, and I spoke about this, that clearly with the Eridas Haderas, right? In other words, different types of svaras and hekeshim, right? At this point in history, when I spoke about it, were not enough, because it could possibly be with the intrusion of Hellenism. So because of that, you could take logical principles and totally unwind them. So there's a freezing process. The freezing process, right, is called the gzeira shava. But freezing things or thawing things has principles, has rules. In other words, what do I freeze, what don't I freeze? Or for example, do I freeze all the way? Do I freeze halfway? We're going to see in Yirtzeh Hashem a Gemara in, I think it's in Zvachim, where basically Rabbi Akiva dashens half of a gzeira shava, and the rest of that is a hekesh. So I don't know, what is that called, freezing? Is that called, making it cold? Or thawing it out? I'm not sure what it's called. In other words, clearly there's a freezing process that's going on, and it could possibly be that this is, in other words, I'm not saying, people get mad when you say, well, the Greeks caused this, but I'm saying is, the fact is that in the Eridas Haderes, where so much is subjected to, logical critique, and, logical critique which can undermine the foundations of the Torah, the thawing process is a type of a new Gilui, revelation of Torah, like Rav Tzadok says over and over again. And this is this freezing process. But the point I wanted to make is that the confusion of Daube and Lieberman is that the Yud Gimel Midas are not logical principles. They have a each of them, or the whole group of them, has a aspect, has a dimension which is logical, but it's a midah is a two-dimensional object. One end is logical, or one axis is logical, one axis is linguistic, and the midas are basically two-dimensional graphs on this two-dimensional surface, on this Cartesian coordinate system, and the different Tanaim draw different curves. One draws a square, one draws a circle. I'm being extremely geometric, but that's really what's going on. So I don't want to say these two articles are trash, but the fact is, because actually after reading the articles, we actually come to appreciate what the Yigim Midas are. But the fact is, the Yigim Midas are very, very Jewish. They're very Yiddish. They have, in my opinion, the fact that coincidentally the logical component, right, Mesorah's Greek rhetoric, doesn't tell me anything about how they're used. They're used in a totally different way. Put it this way, the Greek component, if you want to call it that, I'm not even sure that's even true, but the Greek component, if you want to call it that, is actually just a one-dimensional part of a multi-dimensional field, which according to Rav Tzadok that's called the chitzoni. It's if I could darshan the words of Rav Tzadok, it's the klipa of it, it's not the main thing. The main thing is this interaction. Now actually, as we're going to see in Midas Shem Nigel Midas, that actually the same relationship is to a kavachaymer and a binyan av. There's a parallel relationship between hekesh and gzeira shava, and between kavachaymer and binyan av. Exactly the same thing. Yeah, question.
I don't. Rabbi Triebitz has said a couple of times you'll come back to gzeira shava with a pircha on it, but minor shava. If a gzeira shava defeats logic, then how can you attack it with logic? If you can attack it with logic, then why could somebody make it a vista?
So let me actually for this let me go actually. There's a machlokes Hellenistic Gemara between Ben Cheskas and the Ritva. I'm in the Ritva now. Actually, this is my Shitas Rashi, but I'm looking at the Ritva. It's nicer and it's better print. Anyway, the Ritva in Malach from Beis learns. The River says, I'm on the in the Mesorah of Cook. I'm on Malchut Beis. It says Chidushim Miksav Yad. It's column Siman column Shin Tazayin. Of the Kesler v'Yakol Kon Alem HaMakaref Legay the Rebbe Tzadok HaCohen Adif Ram Nosam Gzeira Adif Lo L'Kol Am Gzeira Adif Shanach Deikol Lebifrach. So the Ritva says, interesting enough, is the Mufne Mitzad Echad V'Lameidin Umeshiva. It turns out there's a sugya in several places in Shas, on the bottom of Chamak Real B'Chafayim and Beis. That's the Shivish place where people know it, but also at the end of the, right, in several places. The question is, the two words of the Chal V'Chaymer, right, are they needed in the Pasuk or the extra? There's a machlokes between Rabbi King and Chachamim. In other words, to what extent do the words of the Chal V'Chaymer have to be extra? It's called Mufne.
Gzeira shava.
I'm sorry, gzeira shava, right. So it's interesting that what's the machlokes here? In other words, according to Rebbe, Rebbe says if it's only moved mitzad echad, evidently this gzeira shava against law is only moved mitzad echad. It's moved mitzad echad, so you could be mafich. In other words, the question is how linguistic is the Chal V'Chaymer? In other words, a Chal V'Chaymer can be super linguistic. Tat l'tivusa, meaning what? Or tat l'tivusa, depends whether you want to use hekesh, you want to use linguistics. If both words are, let's say, mufne, that means both words of the Chal V'Chaymer, gzeira shava, both words of gzeira shava are mufne, they're extra. That's called tat l'tivusa. That's, forget it. You've sealed it. But if only one word is mufne, extra, right? So there's a machlokes. But there's a shita that something which is mufne only mitzad echad, right? You could learn from it. You could learn a Chal V'Chaymer. You could learn gzeira shava from it, but you could ask a pilcha. So in other words, basically a Chal V'Chaymer comes in different colors. In other words, a Chal V'Chaymer can be super linguistic, can be semi-linguistic, and it can be not linguistic whatsoever. Some Chal V'Chaymers, in other words, every time I say Chal is gzeira shava, put an asterisk on it. I have an asterisk. But every time, so in other words, for example, you have all different types of gzeira shavas. For example, here, for example, let me give an example off the top of my head right now, right? In other words, for example, here in this gzeira shava over here, it's muk l'tzad echad, so therefore you may shiv according to it. But for example, There's the most famous gzeira shava that everybody knows from yeshiva. Come on, yeshiva people, now's your time, right? Kicha, Mr. Yafred. Everybody knows. Gemara Kiddushin says that how do we know that you acquire one with kesef? Because, right, the Gemara makes the famous gzeira shava, right? Ki yikach ish isha, and and actually this week's parasha, this is how you saw Gavaldik, Mamish Daube and Lieberman. In other words, Hinei kesef azada kach b'meni. Okay, that's a great gzeira shava. Comes the Ritva, I said Tyson asked this question too. Comes the Ritva and asks an incredible question. What type of gzeira shava is this? In Devarim, the kich is going on the Isha. In Bereshis, in Chayisara, the kich is going on the Kesef. What type of gzeira shava is this? Says the Ritva, even though the Gemara says a gzeira shava, it's not really gzeira shava. It's a gilei milsa. It's a gilei milsa. In other words, the gzeira shava is just come to tell you what he's buying the Isha with. But it's not coming really to equate things, which means, according to the Ritva, since the subject and object of the verb of the two verses, the two psukim, are not at all commensurable, right? So therefore, it cannot possibly be a gzeira shava. And basically, what the Gemara says gzeira shava is really what? It's really a gilei milsa. It's coming. It's like a definition. It's coming to give. It's trying to tell me I'm buying the issue with kesef. That's it. In other words, a gilei milsa means it's just coming to tell you something, but it's not in any way coming to equate two things. Because according to Ritva, to equate two things, they have to line up grammatically. Here, they don't line up grammatically.
What would he say about the bar kohen shava kohen?
What?
The gzeira shava bar kohen.
That's even worse.
That's even worse.
That's even worse.
Does he...
Okay, fine. Okay, we'll speak about this. Okay, that's an interesting. We'll speak about that. If Varsha Kohen says the Meiri, and the Meiri says this, I think, Meiri says this in the comments of the Meiri, that in fact, actually, Varsha Kohen just means we're acquainted to inyanim. But in other words, I mean, I'm going to hundreds of examples. All I wanted to say is that, in other words, to make a linguistic identity, that has to be a commensurate with two things. Now, by the way, don't think that the Ritva, there's no machlokes. I think the Rashba, is chalak in the Ritva, and the Taisa is chalak in the Rashba too. I don't want to give a shiur Kiddushin here, but the fact is, there's actually a machlokes whether in fact grammatical commensurability is a condition for Chava. But in any case, and by the way, it's not committed in the Sugya too. We come to Chalipin, so I don't want to go to the entire thing. But in any case, the bottom line is, what I want to say is that a gzeira shava is not a logical principle. However, it doesn't mean that logic is not part of it either. Because since the gzeira shava is grounded in the hekesh, there's a logical component to the linguistic principle. It's a two-dimensional space. The Midos are two-dimensional. There's no such thing as a gzeira shava. It's a hekesh for gzeira shava. There's no such thing as a kal v'chomer or a binyanav. There's a kal v'chomer and a binyanav. That's the way Rabbi Triebitz is going to be saying the shiur. The Midos are greater than or equal to two dimensions.
Isn't it peculiar that the logical dimension is the thing that comes by Kabbalah, and the non-logical dimension is the thing that is worked out by the person themselves? You would have thought it would be the other way around.
No, because we're creating a text. On the contrary, in other words, previous generations, we trusted the way they thought. The later generations are already, in other words, the thinking is much more. The thinking is much more foggy. They need, we need text. We need. I call that. I come to be like a Yeridus Hadevis, but that's really mamish. I've actually say the Yeridus Hadevis. That's really Yeridus Hadevis. I mean, that has to be true anyway. The generations thinking in time are inversely related. But in any case, that's the. In other words, that's the idea. So in other words, my conclusion is that not only are these articles, in my opinion, totally miss the point of the Yigim Midas, but Baruch Hashem, they were written. They give us actually a very interesting understanding of what the Yigim Midas are. Is that, in other words, when Alexander from Macedonia, Alexander came to Jerusalem, we understand that really what it means like this. In other words, in Nevuah, I don't know what Nevuah is. In Nevuah, you don't have this two-dimensionality. I don't go into Shem Nevuah, but you see, obviously in Nevuah, you don't have this clear two-dimensionality between the logical and linguistic principles. Whereas Nevuah sort of like puts the two things together. When Alexander HaCohen comes to Yerushalayim, right, already you have this bifurcation, text and mind. Logical principle, linguistic principle, right? So, in other words, that's a consequence, I guess, of the time and the Giloy, the revelation of Torah Shebeh as it took place at that time. And I think not only is it not a stira to anything in Torah, I think it's a chizuk for us. That the Yugibel Midos with all the fancy classical, scholarship and rhetoric, right, are just really sort of like a n-1, an n-1 covering on an n-dimensional surface.
So did the earlier generations look at the text as a text then?
More as a text, yeah.
More as a text?
No. It was all together. It was together. In other words, we don't know how the early generators looked at things, but for sure, if you can imagine, right, the Resisei Laila says that Matan Torah, there was no Shem Torah Shnaf Torah Shmial Peh. So here too.
What does that mean? There's no text or there's no Baal Peh?
Somehow the text and I can't even describe it. I'd have to come to different types of mysticism, which some people are more better than I am. But somehow the clear distinction between text and interpretation was not as, the distinction was not as clear in previous generations. I'm not going to try to even guess what it was, because, unfortunately we're locked into our own consciousness. What I'm saying is that's clear. That's clear. In other words, Nevuah, what is Nevuah? According to that, Nevuah is a mingling of what's called the rational, the man's rational consciousness and his imaginary consciousness, right? What is that? We have no concept of what that is. Why no concept of what that is because, either you're rational or irrational. Try to combine the rational and irrational. You get something which is, you can't define it. So, in other words, I wouldn't even attempt to understand what this was. But that I don't need. In other words, I don't need this to understand what's going on in Chazal. Baruch Hashem, it says that Gemara says Daf Hey and Aleph in Bracha is that Moshe Rabbeinu was given, the Gemara is given Mishnah and Gemara. That's the Mishnah and Gemara, Chazal. But this is the Pshat Chazal. But what I say, the Midas are not only logical principles are not the Midas.
So the B'nai B'Seira, thinking back to where we started the first year, the B'nai B'Seira, when they're looking at this text and they're understanding a hekesh, what's Hillel understanding that they're not understanding? He's relating to the text. Hillel. What
Hillel does is Chori had this from Yishmael Rav Talia, but what Hillel does is there's a freezing of the logical principle into a linguistic principle. It's a freezing. That's called the gzeira shava.
Now, how does Hillel know that?
What?
How does Hillel know to do that?
That's Hillel. That's Hillel. That's the how did Rabbi know the Chab of the Mishnah? How did Rabbi Yishmael know it? Hillel understands this is the end of an era, the beginning of a new era, and what do you do? What does Rabbi do at the end of the Tanaim? He freezes the Tanaim. After that's an interpretation of it. You create a text. So how do you create a text? You take an idea and you freeze it in a text, in a canon. That's what you do. That's how you end the Tanaim, that's how you end the Gemara. That's how Hillel ended whatever was before it. It's a freezing process. I'll say it al pi Kabbalah. When I say al pi Kabbalah, I'll say al pi Kabbalah. There was the Leshem explained. Everybody explains, but I'm using the Leshem. Whatever Shachai explains too. If you don't like Leshem, you should like the Chachai. That basically, if you have a hierarchy of worlds, so the world, let's say world N, is the neshama. No, the guf of world N becomes the neshama of world N plus 1, the next world. In other words, the neshama of the higher world, the guf of the lower world, of the higher world, becomes the neshama of the next world. And so on and so forth. In other words, take concept of worlds. This guf is text and the shava. In other words, what happens is the guf, of the guf of the higher world. If I'm coming, in other words, if I'm in the lower world, look at the higher world. You know what I look at it, I don't look at the shava, I look at the guf. You know what? The shava is really the guf of the higher world. In other words, I'm in the lower world. If I look at the higher world, I don't see a neshama, I see a guf. So here too, in other words, what happens is in this freezing process, somehow the logical principles become frozen, become a text. But to what extent do I freeze them? That we see is certainly contingent upon a machlokes tanoim.
So the consequence of them becoming locked together is actually that now they're actually more extensively
connected. Right.
Whereas if it had been up to the Bnei Besorah, in the next door they may have been disconnected and reconnected in a different way. But now that can't be.
Right. Yeah. So that's what I want to say. So in other words, I think the major point here, and actually this is going to guide. I'm going to spend the next few shurim on this. They're going to guide how are the Midos arranged. The Midos come at least in pairs. In fact, we create three-dimensional spaces, maybe even some strings. In other words, the Midos come in pairs. The Midos are actually, like building blocks of logic and language, which come together in different combinations, and that's the genius of the system. The Greek system of rhetoric, I'm sorry, classic says, is only a one-dimensional, it's flat. The Midos are multi-dimensional, and that really is the bottom line. So we will finish this analysis of the Midos in relationship to the scholarship from the undisclosed place of Rishon HaKodesh. Have a good week. Kol Tov.